Okay, so let's get this kicked off. Thank you for joining us today for the Spectrum and Users, What You Need to Know About the Path to Fixed LTE webinar presented by Telrad Networks. My name is Dori Aran of Eye Opening Marketing, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. We would like to hear from you today, so ask questions and share comments. Use the question and answer panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player to share at any time during the webinar. We will also have a couple of poll questions during the webinar. Those will pop up right on your screen, and we'll give you a few seconds to answer each and share the results. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time for questions as well. Today's presenter is Tom Gruba, who has over 30 years of experience in the telecommunications industry in various capacities, including engineering, product management, sales, and marketing. Many of Tom's accomplishments surfaced as he served as Director of Marketing in Alcatel-Lucent's Wireless Infrastructure Division, as Head of Product Marketing at Motorola, and as CMO of their successful Canopy broadband wireless startup. Also presenting today is Steve Coran of the firm Lerman Center. Steve is the chairman of the firm's broadband practice group and serves on its management committee. His practice focuses on the representation of broadband providers and equipment and technology companies, serving their policy, compliance, and licensing needs. He actively represents a trade association before the FCC, Congress, and other federal agencies. Also joining us today is Nick Dewar, Vice President of Systems Engineering and Business Development for Telrad Networks. While not presenting today, he is a wealth of LTE knowledge and will help to answer any product or technical questions that arise. We're proud to have them all here today. And without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Tom Gruba.
Thank you very much, Dori, and thank you everyone for attending today. If you've got questions, as she said, don't be shy. Go ahead and put them in, and Dori will, at the right time, stop me and ask those questions. So the agenda today is really to talk about what's changing in the marketplace. As Dori said, I was with Motorola Canopy in the early 2000s, and so what's changed between then and now. Why spectrum is essential to success, and that's managed spectrum or licensed spectrum. We'll talk about that. And with Steve's help, we'll talk about the latest with CBRS. That's a Citizens Band Radio Service. To many of you, you understand that is 3.5 gigahertz. And we're going to talk about affordability of LTE. A lot of questions around, well, is LTE right for me? And number two, can I afford it? Spoiler alert, yes, you can. And it is set up, at least with Telrad, to work in low density markets. If we talk about the next section, we're going to talk about spectrum. We're going to talk about users and what they're doing. Undoubtedly, many of you have seen that, but let's talk about what you do about it and about the applications that those folks are using. But first, what I like to do is get a poll that we've set up and have you respond to that poll, which helps me during the course of the session ensure that we hit all the points that you're interested in. So, Dori?
Sure, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll. Where are you in the process of evaluating fixed LTE for your network? And the options are determining the business case, investigating LTE technology, evaluating LTE vendors, looking to try it, or perhaps some other.
So I threw you a curveball, Dori. I meant to wait a slide till I covered something, but thank you for being able to adapt to me. Yes. And thank you all for voting and getting your votes in. So 3/4 of you have voted. If we can get a couple more, that would be very helpful. Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much for doing that. It's fun to be able to see the numbers rise.
I'm going to give that just a couple more seconds and then I'll close it out. Okay. So let's see what the results are. We have 13% determining the business case, 16% investigating LTE technology, 26% evaluating LTE vendors, 10% looking to try it, and 35% other.
Very good. That'll be helpful, and that is a distribution not unlike we've seen in previous webinars. So thank you all very much for doing that. If we look at what the big game changers are, it's around users, it's around unlicensed spectrum being used by people that said they would never use unlicensed spectrum, mainly the mobile operators. Plus you have things like smart cities and IoT, which is tremendous pressure. CBRS is about to hit the scene. Everyone's talking about it. We know it's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And with Steve's help, we'll talk about what you need to know at this point of time. And then, of course, the last bit will be that the LTE standard, right, which is the same that you're using for a mobile phone, has been around long enough, and its standard releases go one after the other, and its impact on the fixed wireless market, especially if you're a service provider that really looks to use standards-based products. And so LTE is the same standard that you're using in your phone. Let's talk about one of my favorite parts, which is what's happening with users. If we understand that the world is changing, you have a lot of people that are cutting the cord. So on the left side of the screen, we can talk about the streaming devices that have hit the marketplace. I myself use a Roku player, and there's all kinds of Amazon players, PlayStations, many ways to get streaming video. If you look at the numbers for what that enables is people to cut the cable cord. So in 2010, you see the number there, 4.5% of households cut the cord, but by 2016, and I'll work to update this number, 22%, which represents about 27 million households, have cut the cord. And we all know why. Cable has been very expensive, and sometimes there's just too much choice and not enough decision in terms of what you want to watch. As you look at the impact of streaming video, you understand that that is going to have a certain amount of impact on your network, and that's only going to change as you go from SD to HD to 4K. And recently, Amazon and Netflix both commented on what you would need in terms of stream speeds to meet a 4K video demand. So I think Amazon said 15 kilobits and Netflix recommends 25. I'm sure the answer is somewhere in between. And if you look at what we find in the rural markets, 21% of census blocks have no access to 25 megabit service. So you look at what the demand of what users want, and you look at what they have access to, especially in the rural and remote areas, they're not getting what they need. Now, how that will impact people is if I look at what they're doing in a household, they're not streaming one stream, video stream, they're streaming multiple streams. And for each of those streams, they're taking a certain amount of bandwidth from your network. And what's even more impactful is that you look at the philosophy of people or what they got used to. If it was over the air, you could leave a TV on. It didn't impact anyone. If you had cable TV, you turned it on and it's broadcast, so it didn't bother anyone. But now you look at streaming, and a big impact is people don't think about streaming, the fact that they're streaming, and they will leave televisions on with their Roku player going in different rooms of the house. So you have this great opportunity of people wanting to cut the cord, wanting to bring on more broadband, and you also have to be cautious and understand how they're going to use it, right? That creates a big problem for you as an operator. If you look at what people do on their mobile phones, I bring this slide out because at the bottom you'll see where I've circled Wi-Fi. This is what people do with their mobile devices on Wi-Fi, and you'll notice that the trend is, of course, more and more video. So you see that across the four brands, if I'm at a friend's house or even in my own house, there's more and more use of YouTube. Facebook is becoming more video-like. Chrome is the pink area there, and then the next one, I think, again, is a video streaming service. So this just shows that the changes in the marketplace continue to be driven by video. No surprise to most of you. If I look at the impact on each of you, I'm going to give this example of an LTE stream. And for those of you that have not fully investigated LTE, it's a standard like Wi-Fi is a standard. So if you go to the store and look at buying an 802.11n router, you pick the brand, but you can know that the speed will be the same. Same thing for LTE. If you look at LTE, Nick will tell you that you get 5.5 bits per hertz. So if I'd make the math easy and say 5 bits per hertz times a 20 megahertz channel, you're going to get 100 megabits that you have to work with there. So if we now take the example of the number of streams, video streams per home, if I'm selling someone a 15 meg package, which is the first row there, I may be consuming 2.5 megabits per second as the person in the home. And if the sector capacity at 20 megahertz is 40 homes, and I'm getting a subscription price of $50, you're looking at the cost per home of how much of that capacity are they consuming, so 2.5%. What if they're streaming 2 streams or 3 streams? So if I look at it, even if I'm selling them a package, a higher level package at $75, if you get to 3 streams, you're now consuming 7.5 megabits per second for that household. And now you're looking at the impact on your sector capacity utilization, right? So it reduces down to 13 to 14. So the big challenge is that you've got an average consumption per household on the rise. Things like 4K are going to put the additional pressure on it. And so not only is it a challenge from the standpoint of they're consuming more of your network, but they're doing it with no additional revenue, right? So there's a couple things that we need to talk about. One is what to do about the end user. The second is how do you increase capacity cost effectively and without having to do a lot of different truck rolls. So Telrad's response to that is we have a software-defined radio. So that's why, of course, we're talking about that today. And a software-defined radio means I can just download a capacity feature over the air and increase the capacity of my sector. So I've got a problem. People don't understand best effort. So if you said, Tom, what service do you get? I would say 15 meg. Why do you get 15 meg? I don't know. It hit the right price point. It's not that I figured out all my applications and what I was going to do. Another friend all of a sudden was very excited, said, I get 192 megabit. I said, Greg, what do you do with 192 megabit that I can't do with 15? He didn't know either, and both of us have been in the business for 30 years. So users really don't understand what best effort is. And when the network is not performing the way they think it should perform, they'll call you. And at that point, you try to describe best effort, which they're not going to understand. Users do understand that they're streaming a video, music, or both, and how much of that they want to do. So the idea here, and I've talked to many different operators now over the course of the past three months, some of them are already doing this, and I just suggested it's something for you to consider if you're an operator. That is the fact that you can actually offer the service as a number of streams. So you could offer 1 stream for $50, 2 streams for $75, 3 streams for $100. Now, I'm not picking your price points. I'm just pointing out that for different streams, you have different price points. Some of that would also support music and uploads your photos, things that people understand and use. But it's one way to help a user understand what do they want to use, what should they be understanding that will cost. And this all aligns with your business model. The second piece that's important in that discussion is actually if you're going to compete in a cable area, it's very difficult to compete when the user has been bombarded for the last 20 years with speed numbers. You get 100 megabit service for $50 or $75, or you get 200 megabits for that. It's very difficult as a wireless operator to go in and promise a 15 meg service or 10 meg service that will actually support everything that they want to do. The quality of service will be excellent, but it's hard to compete with end users who understand 100 versus 15 or 20 or 25. So again, the number of streams, charging a stream price takes that argument away and puts you on a different footing. So those are just some ideas that I've been discussing with different people in the marketplace to try to help them, A, compete effectively in a cable market, and number 2, understand that the tide is coming, which everyone has understood, but this gives you some idea of the magnitude. The other problem is how do you increase that network capacity to keep up with demand? So we can talk about the end user and how to help them understand what they're buying, but at the same time, how do you add capacity? So if you look at the mechanisms for keeping up with demand, you can buy equipment that's software upgradable. Again, Telrad has the software-defined radio, and that simply means as we develop the software features to add capacity, it's a software download, okay? The second is looking at, well, what is the feature roadmap that has those capacity features in it? Understanding that will help you make a better equipment decision when it's purchase time. The next is selecting a flexible radio, also called an access point, eNode B in LTE. And if you look at it, there's a 4 transmit, 4 receive antennas compared to a 2 transmit, 2 receive radio. Again, those are antennas. And 4 gives you more flexibility than 2. It gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of being able to mount the radio, use it in more ways, and be able to use it for, let's say, deeper non-line of sight penetration or higher capacity. So when you're looking at radios, if you're making a decision for the longer term and you're focused on the return on investment, not simply the cost of a radio, then you're making a good decision putting in a 4 transmit, 4 receive antenna. The second is wideband radio, meaning how much spectrum can I serve at once? I gave you the example previously of a 20 megahertz channel at 5 bits could give you 100 megabits. Telrad radio does 40 megahertz, can serve 40 megahertz at once, which at 5 bits would give you 200 megabits to work with. We'll also describe on another slide how tunable is that radio. Will it cover everything that I need it to, and it might need to? We'll talk more about that with CBRS. Next is selecting the right spectrum to reduce interference problems. So interference robs the system of capacity. Those of you that are on the technical side understand that. If you look at the challenge with 5 gigahertz today, you could be in certain areas where the noise floor is going to rise and rob capacity. The final bullet I've got there is your understanding of your market and how users and what users are doing also means that you've got a plan for your success in terms of how much spectrum will you need and where will you get it from. So is 20 megahertz enough? Could be today. You may need 40, you may need 60 or even more. If I look at the capacity features to give you an idea of what Telrad is doing, there are several listed here. Carrier aggregation, which we just did a press release on last week, where we're concatenating 2 channels of spectrum and we're making it look like one. So you put them both together, you take 2 20s, put it together, and we're able to demonstrate 200 megabits per second. Multi-user MIMO is a way of making use of those 4 antennas. And what it does is it allows you to carry 2 streams of traffic to different users, essentially doubling the capacity of your sector. Don't count on that in your business case. That's a theoretical doubling. Nick will give you a very good conservative number that's probably more in line with 30 or 40%, unless you're very, very lucky and you've got the right user base in your sector that you could do even more. And then dual sector, again, using the 4 transmit, 4 receive radio enables us to use 2 different channels. They don't have to be contiguous, but they're different. And I can now cover 2 different areas and have the use of double the amount of spectrum. And Nick, if there's anything you want to jump in on there, certainly feel free to jump in. Okay, so what's happening with spectrum? So Dory, I'm going to check my number on this slide. Okay, we still have a couple more before our next poll. Okay, today's challenge with spectrum. More and more companies are requiring spectrum. That's probably not a big surprise to most of you. And the noise floor is rising, but you may not be aware of why it's rising the way it is. You've got all of these different players. And if you look at the first one, mobile wireless carriers are actually now interested in 5 gigahertz, and they're actually deploying product in 5 gigahertz. In addition, electric utilities that were using SCADA data before are now wanting IP pipes all the way out to their substations and other areas in their network. Obviously, those of you that are service providers, Internet of Things is driving the use of spectrum. And so you get through this entire list. And so the demand is creating scarcity. And that's the point there, which means as a service provider, planning for success is paramount to being successful long-term and having a potential to actually sell your business, right, with an exit strategy because you're running a successful business. More companies are using unlicensed spectrum, 2.5 gigahertz. We talked about a lot in 2002. These days, I don't hear much chatter on 2.4. It's all around 5 gigahertz. And in 5 gigahertz, there's use of LTE-U, which is LTE unlicensed, LTE LAA, that's license assisted access, which simply means the operator, the mobile operator, is using a license band for their control channel, and then they'll send the payload down 5 gigahertz. All of this means that if you're in an area that is close to a market that one of the big four is operating in, and even some of the smaller ones, that you're going to have a 5 gigahertz noise floor rise, okay? So when it reduces the capacity, you're buying radios these days that may be 256 QAM or some other technique, but you're not going to get to be able to use that radio because the signal to noise ratio will not allow that radio to operate at that higher rate. So you buy an expensive radio and you can't even use it, or you can't get the full benefit out of it. I shouldn't say you can't use it, you just don't get the full benefit. And the final point is, we talk about rural operators and you say, well, this doesn't happen in rural, right? It depends on your definition of rural. I grew up in central Illinois. The town I grew up in was 35,000, which is certainly a big enough market for Sprint, Verizon, AT&T, and others to serve that marketplace. So depending on when you say rural, are you talking remote areas of rural, or are you actually talking rural communities? Because it will make a difference. So the noise floor rise, as I described, the higher modulation schemes like a 256 QAM, they just can't tolerate the increase in noise floor. So for those of you that are on the business side, I usually talk about it as either driving up a mountain where you have to go from 5th gear down to 4th to 3rd to 2nd as it gets steeper and steeper, or the other example is if you're at a party, right? For the first two people into the party, we can talk across the room, probably talk as fast as I'm talking now with no problem, but as the party fills up, you get down to where you're transmitting fewer and fewer words and you're trying to ask one-word questions. That's no different than how our radio operates today. So with licensed spectrum being the business imperative, especially if you're serving business customers, you want to first determine, is my service area at risk? Only you can understand that, you know where you are. And then the second is, well, what are my options? So 2.5 gigahertz is an option. There's a lot of educational institutions that have 2.5 licenses that may or may not even know that they have one. So there are companies like Select Spectrum and people like Leanne Spellman that can help people investigate and pursue 2.5 gigahertz in their particular area. From a 365 standpoint, I talk to people every now and again. They're willing to sell their 365 license. At the latest show I was in, I understand between $5,000 and $6,000 the going price for a 365 license. And what you want to do is you want to grab that before someone else acquires it. And for those of you that don't know, 365 is in the middle of the band when we start talking about CBRS and everything going on with 3.5 gigahertz. So Steve will talk about that. So Steve, this is probably a good spot for you to come in because it covers 253 and what might be happening. So is that fair?
Yep, let's go. So let me just kind of cover each of these bands separately. And thanks to Dorian once again for inviting me to participate on these webinars. So the 2.5 gigahertz band is really two different bands. It's the broadband radio service, which is commercial, and it's the educational broadband service, which is not. And in either case, that spectrum can be leased. You can't acquire the EBS spectrum, but you can lease it. I want to say 80% or more of this band is controlled, meaning they either hold licenses or leases by Sprint, which is rolling out LTE. But there are some stray cats and dogs out there that you can acquire. And there are a number of WISPs and others that have acquired 2.5 gigahertz spectrum where it's been available to do more regional and localized play. The benefits provides predictable capacity and protection across an area covering a 35-mile radius from a center point, minus any overlaps. And it propagates real well. It's a pay-as-you-go model when you lease. You don't have to buy it all up front. You are subject to a lease and a leasing arrangement that the FCC approves. And you can provide quality of service to enterprise customers with a high degree of confidence. So that is an option. It's hard to find, but there are some places out there where if you know the right tools, you should be able to identify areas where spectrum may be available. Understand recently that Sprint is back in the spectrum game, so they will probably be, and I know they are, contending for that spectrum right now in ways that they were not over the last couple of years. So that's a recent development in that space. The 3 gigahertz citizens broadband radio service is critical to the spectrum assets and the growing need for spectrum to handle all these bandwidth needs that Tom's been talking about. This spectrum sits right next to the 3650, 3700 megahertz band that I know a lot of folks have been using. So this is an additional 100 megahertz that's available right below that. Projection early 2018, yes, if you're doing an experimental deployment, and I know Telrad has participated in a number of experiments, I want to say 12 or more. I think, for commercial use of the spectrum, we're looking at probably later this year based on some kind of recent things that I've been hearing from the FCC and the standards body, which is the Wireless Innovation Forum. This is an automated spectrum sharing band. There are 3 tiers. There are incumbents, which are the federal government and earth stations. There is the second tier, which is priority access licensing, which is protected except as against those incumbents. And then you have the lower tier, which is general authorized access, or GAA. It operates as a license by rule, which means you go to the spectrum access system to get permission to use the spectrum. And there is some spectrum set aside specifically for GAA, and also where that priority access license is not being used, there is an opportunity to use it on an opportunistic basis when and where that licensee is not using it. If you have a 3.65 license, that is grandfathered in if you met certain conditions prior to April of last year, and also registered those with the FCC by August of last year. That gives you certain squatters' rights as against any users that may come along between now and 2020. There's some changes being talked about in this band that many of you may be aware of, and I would just say we don't know how that's going to ultimately turn out, but there will be plenty of general authorized access use, and I'm very hopeful that preserving the ability to get protected licenses, those priority access licenses in rural areas, will be assured once we hit the end of the rulemaking proceeding. Finally, we have some new spectrum discussions.
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
Steve, Tom.
Yeah.
I see a couple questions come in here regarding the 2.5 and 3. So it's a good time for Dory. Can you give those, feed
sure.
those questions?
I was gonna let Steve get through the slide and ask. So one of them was about the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, if that's EBS.
It's broadband radio service, so it's BRS, and it's EBS, which is educational broadband service, and they share the 2496 to 2690 band. So it's 190 megahertz, give or take, that's chopped up into a number of different licenses.
And the second question is, if you already have a well-established 3.65 gigahertz license for an area to gather the required Earth Station coexistence agreement with AT&T, do you genuinely have the freedom to switch your transmitters and customers to LTE? I'm getting conflicting inputs. Some say the license does not allow any changes of equipment.
Yeah, so I think it's the question of whether you retain your grandfathering if you change out equipment. It's a good question. The guidance I've gotten from the FCC is if you're not changing your technical parameters, meaning your height, your footprint, your sector ranges, etc., you should be okay. But they're going to want you to include an exhibit when you file your modification, tying that back to the grandfathered stations so that you can be assured of it. And that's something that we've done a few times and can help folks out with if you need a little confidence in navigating the FCC system. So it's doable if you do it the right way, in my view. If you're going to be changing the parameters, or if you're going to be changing location or changing the height or going from sectors to omnis or changing your sectors, that's a little bit of a different story, because then you really are changing the areas where you might need to be protected.
Okay, another question is, if you had a 3.65 license for years but didn't register any locations by August, did you lose your license?
You didn't lose your license, you lost the ability to grandfather any locations that you would have registered by April of 2015. So you still have a license, you can still register those locations, you just will not be given grandfathered protection. You will need to then re-register and get permission from the SAS, the Spectrum Access System, once that goes live. One other thing is that anything that's deployed is going to have to go through a certified professional installation process. If you think about it, why should we have to do that for stuff that's already hung on a 1,000-foot tower? And I think that's something that needs to get resolved and will be worked on. There should be a simpler method than having somebody come out and climb your tower and worst case, have you sort of have to go off the air while that whole thing happens, which I don't think anybody wants to happen, but don't know if anybody has really sort of focused on that at the FCC or in the standards body.
Very good. So Steve, now I think is a good time to go ahead and finish the talk about 3.7 because I wanted to avoid confusion. And
yep, no problem. And I can also talk about some other long-term bands that kind of fit in here. So the 3.7 to 3.8 is actually part of a band that goes from 3.7 to 4.2, 500 megahertz, and that is currently being used by C-band receive fixed satellite earth stations. And there is a group that includes WISPA, Mimosa, Telrad, New America, about 33 different people that have gone to the FCC and said, hey, let's open that band up for 500 megahertz of for point to multi-point on a frequency coordinated basis. The satellite guys don't like it. The mobile guys would like to have that spectrum. So we're in the middle of getting ready to have a fight over that. I won't go into too much detail, but one of the proposals there is to take this 3.7 to 3.8, which is the upper half of LTE band 43, and strap that onto CBRS. I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen, but having a band that's adjacent to 3.65 to 3.7 that will at some point be opened up for commercial point to multi-point use, I think something like that will happen. I don't know if it's going to be 500 megahertz or 100 megahertz or something in between and what the conditions are going to be, but we're going to see that. And then the the NTIA has recently said, hey, we're going to look at stuff below 3.55. And although that's on a longer path and is currently being used by, I want to say, the Navy, point is that this band has been put into play as well. So you're looking at pretty much everything from 3.1 to 4.2 is in play for this mid-band LTE / IoT / 5G / whatever you want to call it. So pretty exciting time and pretty good opportunity for folks to be thinking about all the ways that the mid-band spectrum on both a micro and a macro level can be used to advance your business.
awesome. Thank you very much, Steve. I have two more slides on spectrum, and then we'll move into why fixed LTE, which will cover the business case, investigating LTE technology, and evaluating vendors. So two more slides here. And this one is, people will tell me, but the spectrum's expensive, it'll kill my business case. Actually, fixed spectrum is cheaper than mobile spectrum by a lot. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, this slide was done by Wireless 2020, which is a consulting firm. They found that the 2.5 gigahertz, the price for mobile was about $1 per megahertz pop. Forget the pops for a minute, that's population, but the dollar per megahertz. So if I had 20 megahertz, it'd be $1 times 20. But you look at $1 versus 35 cents. So drastically different price points for getting that spectrum. And of course, 3.5 to 3.65, you're saying, well, what's the price for? Well, if you're doing a PAL, so when Steve talked about PALs, priority access license, you actually can bid on those and at some point in the future. And they looked at it as a 30 cents on the dollar, 30 cents per megahertz pop. You say, why 30 cents? It seems awfully strange. But if you look at the performance of 2.5 versus 3.5, what the firm did is they looked at it and said, well, 3.5 is not quite as valuable as 2.5, and so we're going to hedge our bets and call it 30 cents. Now, having said that, this is what I expect on the high end of things. I have talked to customers that have gotten 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, depending on where they are. Obviously, more secluded places, the value wasn't there. They were buying it in the teens or even less. At 3.5, it's a guess what people will pay for a PAL license. In other words, if you're in an area where there's not a lot of competition, you'll probably get a great price on it. If you're in an area with a lot of competition, it will cost you more. But all in all, this is not spectrum for fixed wireless, works for the business case, and it gives you that peace of mind and ability to offer service level agreements to customers. Now, if I talk about, selecting the right radio, as Steve discussed, there's a lot of things that are about to happen. And you look at a tunable radio. So for those of you that are technical and understand this, you'll get this immediately. For those of you on the business side, I tell it like this. A tunable radio, how much of the band can I tune across, is no different than when I tell my sons what I do for a living. And I said, we get in the car, I said, would you buy a radio that didn't scan the entire band of FM, right? So you start the low end of the FM band and you tune it all the way up to the high end. I said, well, no, that'd be dumb. I said, well, what we're trying to do is have wide enough radio that allows our operators the flexibility to work anywhere within that band. So the radio is tunable across 300 megahertz, and it'll service 40 megahertz at any one point in time, which will come out of that 300 megahertz. So it's a 300 megahertz tunable radio with serviceable area, which means 40 megahertz can be served at that 5 bits per hertz. You would have 200 megabits. So the way you get there is that little second bullet underneath the second big bullet, carrier aggregation. So that's what we just tested last week. So we actually, and Nick, this is where you could come on, we actually tested the 20 by 20, so I can update my slide because we now got 200 megabits per second. What this really does for you is it provides investment protection, and the drawing down below says, well, what do you mean by aggregating these channels? You could have a 10 megahertz carrier at the low end of the band, that's on the left, and you could have it at the top end of the band, and the radio will aggregate them together and treat it as one. Nick, given our announcement this week, is there anything you'd like to add at this point?
I think you made the point very well, Tom, simply that the channels do not need to be contiguous in frequency, and ultimately we can aggregate in order to achieve higher peak rates. This is very much so aligned with things such as CAF2 requirements, or the ability to offer 100 meg service, for instance, as the upper end of CAF funding. This can certainly be a valuable tool in doing so.
Yeah, that's a great point. When you're looking at CAF funding, being able to bid and providing a higher level of service with the FCC will give you a better probability of winning. So for those of you that will look at the slides later, I have some key takeaways that I like to do. And now we'll get into why fixed LTE. But first, we're going to throw another poll at you. So Dory, can you help me with that?
Absolutely. I'll launch it now. So this poll is, what is holding you back from making the move to fixed LTE? Is it that you're not sure there is a business case, acquiring spectrum will kill your business case, you don't know which vendor to choose, or you're not sure what value fixed LTE brings to your business?
Okay, we've got 30% of you, 33% of you that have voted, so thank you, keep going. We're now at 50%. There we go, 50%. We've just crossed the hurdle. We can get to 100. All right, we're at 60.
Okay, I'm going to give that a few more seconds.
71. Come on, guys, get in there.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll now.
Okay.
So here's the results. 18% of you said you're not sure there's a business case. 18% also said acquiring spectrum will kill your business case. 42% said don't know which vendor to choose, and 21% not sure what value fixed LTE brings to your business.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about some of those things. in terms of a business case, we'll talk about why fixed LTE, and I think some of that will become obvious. And then acquiring spectrum will kill my business case. Like I said, there are people that can help with that. And from a business case perspective, for those of you running a larger network, then it certainly makes sense because you're going to get the ability to scale. So we'd love to talk to you, those of you that that feel that it would kill your business case, because we have operators throughout Canada, the US, and around the globe, all of who are running successful businesses. So would really like to understand your viewpoint on that one. And for those of you who don't know which vendor to choose, hopefully you'll at least understand what our offering is by the end of this discussion. And for those of you who are not sure what value fixed LTE brings to your business, we're in that section too. So first off, if you look at this slide, this was from a report that was commissioned by WISPA, and it was done by the Carmel Group. And I summarized some key points. If you're in a WISP organization, the types of revenues you're seeing out there, 70% are over $40 per month. So that's a great starting point when you're looking at a business case that says, look at that, 70% is over $40, with 23% of that 69% above that in $51 to $60, and 27% of that 70%, it's over $60. So those are some very healthy revenues. And as a friend of mine in private equity said, when I bumped into him at a wireless show, I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "We figured out that the WISPs and the rural telco operators, if you provide a good service and you treat your customers right, they never go away. And it's just a terrific business." So that came from a guy in private equity. In addition, you look at what's going to be impactful to a person like that. It's the minimum amount of churn. You will get some churn. Some people just, they lose a job, they can't afford it anymore. But you're looking for the most part, and most of those folks, you're in the churn range of less than 1%. Subscriber acquisition costs are in that reasonable $200 to $400 range. If you're looking from a marketing perspective of subscriber acquisition cost, I can help you with ideas and tactics that are much cheaper. If the subscriber acquisition cost from this report is the equipment side of things, that's about right. You're going to look at CPE that's going to cost $200 to $250, but it's going to stay on that rooftop for a long time. And if you look at our 9000 product, the CPE 9000, it is a category 6 device. And you're going to say, well, what does that mean? That means it supports carrier aggregation that Nick just talked about. Growth, 57% of the respondents, and I believe there was over 200 people that were polled for the survey, reported 11% a year annual growth. And I've thrown that number out, and I've been told we're doing better than that. So depending on where you are, I'll move on from there. So the top 10 reasons why LTE makes sense for fixed. So for those of you that are looking at, your questions that you provided through the polls, non-line of sight. So the key with LTE is it uses a technology called OFDM-A, not a technology, I'm sorry, it's a modulation scheme, OFDM-A, which provides that modulation scheme combined with the antennas. So LTE is the first technology that its standard form is 2 antennas. You don't ever offer it as 1 antenna, it's 2 antennas. And what we offer is 4 antennas because of getting to non-line of sight, which is a big problem for operators in a lot of different environments. What that means for you on a business side is more share per tower. Ability to offer service level agreements. So if you've been offering customers today a service level agreement with an unlicensed spectrum, we always say, how well do you sleep at night, right? And sometimes I get an answer back, so it's just like a baby. I wake up every 2 hours and cry. So here's a way with managed spectrum or licensed spectrum, non-line of sight capability to offer those service level agreements to your business customers who are, they want a good service and they're willing to pay for it. For those of you looking at an exit strategy, the eventual exit strategy, you will get some value by having LTE as opposed to proprietary unlicensed products. An equity firm or a buyer will value those at 0 because their first assumption is you're going to have to rip and replace. In addition, when you talk about having LTE, loans are easy to come by because it is a standards-based technology. We found that by talking to a couple operators that is the case. Previously, they had had some challenges. It's a scalable architecture, so it's the same technology used by the mobile operators. So for those of you that are really looking to scale your networks, this is a technology that will absolutely do that. Now, from a business protection, you'd say, well, okay, my big problem is going to be this rising video consumption and the thirst of users for more capacity. The roadmap for LTE is driven by the top mobile operators in the world. That is all done by an organization called the 3GPP, and they every year work on different releases. And LTE, which is a 4G technology, rolls into 5G. So it's a continuous path. It's not an option to hop off here or there. It's a continuous path. So the capacity roadmap, all the great features and things that people create, the brightest minds in the wireless industry, they're the ones driving this forward. So that should give you some idea that it's not just one vendor making a decision on their roadmap and what's going to happen. It's standards based. Lots of manufacturers, so reducing your risk. If a manufacturer goes a different direction, you can go off and buy a different CPE from a different manufacturer, whatever you need, so long as you find a manufacturer that can meet that need. LTE being carrier grade, Nick can go on a lot about why our product is carrier grade in terms of its manufacturing and reliability and performance. But that's what's important to a lot of the operators, especially if you're a telco or someone else that's been a service provider and you're used to that type of robustness in your network. CPE options and manufacturers, so you get a much more robust portfolio of options to meet more and more of your different needs as an LTE technology. And then the last, and I think one of the most important, and in fact, I was having this discussion with Nick earlier today, but LTE is a new technology from the standpoint of people in the wireless business having dealt with anything this complex. LTE by its nature is a great technology, but it's not what has been marketed previously as easy as Wi-Fi. It is definitely not. And you have to go about it the right way or it ends with problems and a lot of unhappiness. So if you look at the available talent pool out there, there are thousands of engineers that have been trained up by mobile operators in LTE technology. They understand what it takes. Nick and his team understand what it takes. And the first thing you need is a good radio network plan. And that's usually the first thing that people want to throw out the window. They don't want to do it because they've been able to be successful with the line of sight technology. But as I talked to one individual at the show, he was a builder by trade in his early years. And I said, would you ever build a house or a building without a blueprint? And he said, of course not. I said, well, LTE is just like that. So that's where we are with LTE for fixed.
Hey, Tom, we have a question. Will your radios be software upgradable to 5G standard?
These radios will not. And when I say 5G standards, what I presume that person to mean is a 5G new radio. So let me explain. You will hear 5G, which is very confusing. And I talked to an analyst firm recently, and they said that one of the top questions we get is, what is 5G? And they don't mean I don't read about it. It's a confusing topic. So 3.5 gigahertz has been called a 5G band. Millimeter wave bands, the 28 gigahertz, 38 gigahertz, these bands are being talked as the short range multi-point 5G, okay? But those are the frequencies. They don't have anything really to do with the technology. The technology gets to when you talk about 5G new radio, which that new radio is being designed to provide lower latency so that your self-driving apps and things like that can work. And it's being done for the higher capacities. And so the modulation schemes and all of the things they need to do fundamentally start at the chip level and have to be redeveloped. So no, our existing platform won't be 5G from a new radio standpoint, but by the time the 5G new radio actually comes out and you let the big guys, the big mobile operators sort through all the bugs and problems, we'll have a platform that supports it. Great question. In terms of CBRS, I think we covered this pretty well, the top part. So it's providing additional 100 megahertz of spectrum. That's the key for you. with the breakup, as Steve talked about, is 80 megahertz of that being a general access, meaning you can get access to it. And then 70 megahertz is the PAL, that's things, it's a license that you can pay for spectrum up to 40 megahertz. So the government's put a limit that says if you're in an area you want to bid on PALs, we'll allow you to do it up to 40 megahertz. I already told you that 5.5 bits per hertz is the general capacity rule of thumb. And if you look at other technologies on how they're successfully delivering more bits, they're actually using much larger channels in unlicensed. We talked about the risk of running unlicensed. Now, I want to be clear. We think that an operator should use whatever tools they need to be successful. So if you're using unlicensed, then it works for you in a line of sight way, and you need to combine LTE with it to provide non-line of sight. There's nothing wrong with that approach, absolutely. But it's just being clear about how to reduce business risk by incorporating managed spectrum or licensed spectrum and LTE into your portfolio. So this is a slide I have in here that if you want to look at, you can, but it's really, if I'm an operator, what are my goals? I want to increase market share per tower. I do that by having non-line of sight capability and enough capacity. I've heard that in the WISP marketplace, 3 years is the life cycle for equipment on the tower. That's why having a software-defined radio and those features means that we're going to double the life. And I talked to an operator out of Texas that said, I'm actually planning to get 8 years out of that technology on the tower. So it's drastically different, which is why you cannot look at simply the price of an E node B relative to what you're using in unlicensed today, because it's a return on investment model, not a, do I have enough money to pay for the radio? So if you're looking at the bigger network, you're probably going to get some financing or have ways of looking at making that investment. I know we're getting short on time, so I'm going to hop ahead here. So obviously non-line of sight, and you're starting out with a 4x4 radio, which gives you maximum non-line of sight capability if you need that capability. You're leveraging capital efficiently, and I've got a great slide I'll show you in a minute on why that is. That is because we have 6 deployment options with the same radio. And then the higher value services, which are meeting the needs of your customers and technology you're going to need beyond the radio to support that business need. So let's talk about that. So LTE is fundamentally a layer 3 technology. Everything's integrated right down to your handset. So if you're addressing a business user's needs, you need a bridge, and a bridge is called a layer 2 device. And so if you're looking at providing, doing elimination of lease lines, or if you're looking at avoiding double NAT, you're looking at being able to have all of the layer 2 features and functions that aren't part of the standard that Telrad had to write from the ground up. When I talked to Nick, he says, we provide real layer 2, meaning we have done all the features, not just a subset of those features. So we have everything you need, and that is a whole conversation that you would have with someone like Nick or someone on his team to understand exactly what that looks like. The third bullet that you see there is 3GPP does not truly define static IP. For many people, they need that, and so therefore it's another example of what you have to have above and beyond the radio to provide service to business customers. We have that. Some of the operators, just to give you some idea, Red Zone operates throughout the state of Maine. You have several others here. These are all good size operators. They're running major networks. They're deploying LTE for a lot of the business reasons that we talked about. We have a much more robust portfolio of it, but you start putting all those on one slide, it gets pretty small. Okay, here's one of our favorite slides. If you're looking at how do I get started in an area that I'm unsure of, or how do I get there cost effectively in a low density deployment, I turn your attention to the upper left, the one marked 1. We'll actually sell a 4x4 radio, license it to you as a 2x2 radio, and allow you to pay as you grow. So this is a great way if you want to go test a new market. It's a great way if you've got lower density deployments, because you can go in with using the radio as a 2x2 radio. You can get up to 100 megabits a second, and so you can get deployed cost effectively. The second and third are effective ways of using the radio in a couple of different configurations. I'll turn your attention to 3, where it's dual sector and dual carrier. So dual sector means I can serve 2 sectors in different areas, like you see the picture. And the dual carrier means I can actually use 2 different chunks of spectrum to do that. So we have a couple different ways that we've deployed with operators that makes it very cost effective for them to get started. So our philosophy is if you grow, we grow. So we're looking at ways to make it simple. So things like the Evolved Packet Core, which is a necessary entity in LTE. It's very simple. It is your signaling gateway. It's your packet gateway out to the internet. And it's also the interface to do your billing authentication and things like that. So you have to have an Evolved Packet Core because it's part of the standard. We take that, slice it up, and do it as part of the cost of the radios and the users that you're serving. If I turn your attention to the bottom row, if you're in a very tree-lined area, so I live in Chicago, love to go to Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, you may need the maximum non-line of sight penetration. That means you're going to use all 4 of those antenna in a way, the most effective way to penetrate that non-line of sight area. If you're looking at maximum peak rate, that's what we talked about in terms of the press release that we just did. 200 megabits per second is what you see. And then the final one, number 6, is if you're looking at maximum spectral efficiency, that's something called multi-user MIMO, multiple input, multiple output. It's a way of being able to take 2 streams and feeding users in that same sector with 2 different streams. So it's a complicated feature, but it's one that actually will increase the capacity in that area. But I will caution you, if you're using it that way, a number 6, you can't also be expecting a number 4. So if you need maximum line of sight penetration, you'll be deploying the radio that way. If you have the flexibility in the future, you can actually double, and you're not effectively going to double, but you're going to increase the number of subscribers that can be served in the sector. So the point is, we're providing multiple means of helping you serve the customer.
Tom, we have a couple questions.
Great.
Given LTE's non-line of sight strengths inside buildings, does Telrad provide a USB transceiver for 3.5 gigahertz LTE, e.g. for plugging into laptops and tablets? If not, does Telrad have any plans to release one in the near future?
So I'm going to have Nick help me with that because he deals with the portfolio. And we've got a picture up here.
Yeah, we in our portfolio have a MiFi device, which would be essentially a subscriber unit hotspot that can broadcast Wi-Fi. In terms of a device that has actual USB, the MiFi device can be tethered physically versus using the Wi-Fi and connected to a PC via USB and used as an external modem as well.
We also have a couple questions for a couple of the previous slides, Tom.
Okay.
The carriers are trying to increase the size of a CBRS bidding area. If a small provider can't bid on these bigger blocks, will GAA still be available for the small provider?
Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, the premise is if census tracts or small areas are not available for the bidders, and I don't see that as being realistic, at least in rural areas where I think there will be some census tracts preserved, as maybe as many as all 7. But you know, if that changes, then you know you're looking at having to bid for counties or acquiring spectrum on the secondary market for whoever has the PALs, or just continuing to use GAA. I think that the timeline for mobile carriers to deploy 5G in 3.5 is a lot longer than a fixed wireless provider wanting to initiate service. So there may be an opportunity to kind of use the spectrum opportunistically for several years.
Okay. Also, we have a question. What frequencies are the existing LTE providers using?
So what frequencies are existing LTE providers? If you're in Canada, you can use 2.3. In the US, we're using 2.5 and 3.65.
And another question, what is the typical capacity in users for users per sector for the 6 different deployment scenarios?
So that's a great question. It depends on the service you're going to provide. So if you were providing in a low ARPU, low density market, you could have a radio that is covering that sector. And then what you have to figure out is what is your service offering? Is that going to be a 1 meg service, a 2 meg service? What are you going to offer? And then we calculate it back from there. So that's where our sales team, and with people like Nick, we can actually calculate that out for you. The customer in Texas is running 65 subs per sector at the moment. He says that's where life is good for him, but unfortunately I did not ask him what offerings he has or what the users are doing, because as the users, a lot of times the business users are actually, they use less capacity. They want to make sure that the service is there, but they're not streaming video all the time, like when the kids come home and do that. And Nick, you may have something to add there.
Just in general, it really comes down to oversubscription. If it's a basic 10 down, 1 up type of service, a high level number would be 75 users per 20 megahertz. With dual carrier, that would be effectively 150 users on a base station using 220 megahertz channels. Blended services, say for instance, a blend of 10, 15, and 20 megabit downlink. The average users could be, say, 40 to 50 users per 20 megahertz carrier.
Thank you. And one more. I have a 3.65 license. Can I buy your radios and start service, or do I have to wait until the rules are finalized?
You can actually buy the radios and deploy now, right? I think.
Yes, yeah. Maybe Steve wants to comment, but in general, you just would not be grandfathered. But you could absolutely commercially deploy under Part 90 with your existing license as of today.
Yeah, you do need to register your locations, and I think what Tom and Nick have both said is that because that radio is software defined, that once the CBRS band opens up commercially, it should be just a software update in order to allow you to operate commercially, with the little asterisk being that certified professional installation process that you're going to need to go through, which hopefully will be somewhat truncated and just be something that's done on paper.
Thank you. We also have another, connected users are simultaneous users.
Well, the numbers that I provided were based on connected users. Simultaneous is based on oversubscription. So in the example I provided, it's based on a 10 to 1 oversubscription, which we often see. Some people may want to take a more conservative approach, or maybe you're servicing specifically businesses and drop that to a 7 to 1 or a 5 to 1. But in general, it really comes down to the business model and the oversubscription. So we have customers with upwards to even 100 subscribers on a 20 megahertz channel, and then we have customers with as few as 40 and 50. So it really does depend on the usage patterns, the oversubscription model for the your organization, and of course the usability of the system.
Thank you. And one more. Do you have an in-depth class schedule in the near future?
We do. We're happy to follow up with a link for that. It's posted on our website under Telrad training. It's scheduled, I think, for 2nd or 3rd week in May. That said, we also have a bi-weekly webinar, which is a 2-hour product intro. We call it What You Need to Know Before You Get Started. I would highly recommend anyone looking at our product attend that webinar and at least get your feet wet in terms of understanding of the system and so forth, and that's a link that can also be made available.
Thank you, guys. So I've got a slide up here, how to get started with Telrad. So if you're looking to try the equipment, if you're looking to have the conversation about the business case, if you're looking to understand what your network would be like, talk to one of our sales reps. Here's the email address of Mike Cook, who's our VP of North America Sales, mike.cook@telrad.com. Pretty simple. You can find any of us that way. So tom.grube@telrad.com works too. We can discuss any of these things, right? The different deployment options, what it means to have an end-to-end solution, everything that you obviously need to know before you make that important decision to move forward. If you want to spend a day with us, on the next slide and at our website, I'll show you where we're going to be in terms of road shows, industry events, or even just setting up a meeting with us. We have what we call a starter kit, so you can get You can get going by purchasing one of those. Nick and his team actually work with you to help make sure that you have a good experience. So that's something very important.
Tom, maybe now's a good time to launch that last poll that's asking if people are interested in a trial kit.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and put that on right now. Anybody who is interested in generating that conversation with the sales rep and in getting that started with the trial kit, this is your opportunity to do so, and we'll make sure someone contacts you.
Yeah, terrific. That would be great. Thank you very much, Dory. I forgot about that, so my mistake.
No problem.
And thank you for your participation. The last slide, and then we can take any additional questions that people may have. I understand we're at a little over the hour here, so thanks for hanging with us. We put previous webinars, and this one will end up on YouTube. So if you ever want to share it, just let us know. We can do that. I think we send that out to our sales guys, so if you contact one of them, they'll know. The next webinar, if you want to hear this again, maybe I'll be a little smoother next time. April 12th is the next one, and the times we state are in Eastern time. And I'm interested in your feedback. What kind of stuff did we not talk about today that you'd like to see in a webinar? So when I talk about LTE being a more complex technology, one of the things I'm thinking about after the discussion with a person coming out of the show last week is, what do you need to know to be successful at deploying LTE? Our events website is, as you see listed there. The next one's coming up. I'm actually going to hit Des Moines, Iowa next week for their broadband conference. And then there's Texas Expo at the beginning of April. I'll be speaking at the IP Vision in New Orleans, so come on out and see us there. And then there's going to be the NTCA regional shows. We're going to go ahead and do those. Those are in July and August. Those are in, I think, Hilton Head, in Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and Fargo, North Dakota. And then the last one we're going to do a road show next to will be the one in Ohio. And I just can't remember if that's Cincinnati. Is that Cincinnati, Dory? But it will be in Ohio. And that will be July and August. Those dates are already firmed up on the NTCA website. And then, of course, Wispapalooza, the last week of, or the 8th to 12th of October. And then we'll probably be at the NTCA fall event in Seattle, and I believe that's in September. So those are where you can find us. Do we have any additional questions, Dory?
Yes, we do. There's a couple questions about the slide deck being made available. We're going to send out a follow-up to this with a link to the webinar for anybody to be able to view. Also, there's a question, what's the cost for a starter kit?
That's a good question. I don't know that. Nick, do you happen to know that?
I don't off the top of my head. It would be sub 10,000. We can certainly create a follow-up for something like that.
Yep.
With Mike Cook, the email I think was provided.
Yep, mike.cook@telrad.com. So
that's
any
the
other
last
questions?
question I see. Yep. Okay.
Sure.
So I think it looks like we've covered up all the questions. Tom, is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, just a special thank you. If people have questions, then if I wasn't clear on something, please send me an email, tom.gruba. It's like scuba, but Gruba, G-R-U-B-A, @telrad.com.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone. We really appreciate you being here. And thanks to Tom, Nick, and Steve for their time. We'll be sending out the follow-up email with the link to the presentation. And we'll also have a short survey that will launch as we end the webinar. And we'd really be grateful for all of you to complete it and to help us improve. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.